The games industry in Japan started life in the arcade. In America, you could argue that it began in the offices of a young Atari. But in Britain, the business had a very different start. Over here, it began in the bedrooms of teenagers all across the nation. Computers in the UK took a while to get going. Devices from America were prohibitively expensive, and the only thing you could buy from Britain required you to hand solder about 3,000 joints on a circuit board. They were for hobbyists only. But in the early 80s, things changed. Electronics firm Acorn forged a partnership with the state broadcaster, which gave the newly christened BBC Micro nationwide prominence. And electronics inventor Clive Sinclair launched the ZX line of computers, culminating in the ZX Spectrum, which were enormously successful thanks to the ultra-low price point of around £100. Joined by the American-made Commodore 64, this trio of microcomputers wormed their way into the average British home. And once they were there, people started coding. That's thanks to the fact that the computers all ran some version of BASIC, an easy-to-use programming language. Plus, the manuals taught you about if statements and loops, and computer magazines were full of tips and sample code. Among the first things people made were games. Most of them were rip-offs of the arcade cabinets that were popping up along the seafront, but there were original ideas too. These were games made in bedrooms and in college dorms. They were made by single creators, or perhaps a pair of friends or brothers. Soon enough, these people realized that they could copy their game onto a cassette and actually sell them. Perhaps take out an advert in a magazine and sell through the post. Or sell them at a computer fair. Get the code published in a magazine for a few quid. Or sell them to an independent computer shop. It was a cottage industry, with early game designers stuffing cassettes into envelopes in their kitchen. Very quickly, though, the industry started to grow, especially when high street chains like WH Smith's and Boots started to stock games. Now, if you wanted to sell big, you needed access to a proper cassette duplication machine, someone to make full-page magazine ads, and perhaps even offices overseas. And so began the software house, or what we'd now call a publisher. Essentially a small company that would handle the sales and distribution of a bunch of different games. They might have a few in-house programmers making software, but they would also buy games from freelancers or youngsters in their bedrooms in exchange for royalties or a fat one-off fee of, say, £1,000. A huge number of software houses popped up all across Britain, like Quicksilver in Southampton, Hewson Consultants in Oxford, Gremlin Interactive in Sheffield, and Bugbite in Liverpool. Each one had its own style and brand. Software Projects had a distinctly odd art style across its game collection. Ocean Software secured the licenses to upcoming films and Olympic athletes. US Gold snatched up the rights to games made in America, like Sid Meier's early flight sims. And Ultimate Play the Game maintained a cool reputation by only publishing its own ultra-high quality titles like Jetpack and Knightlaw. And so it was during this period that we saw the games that would go on to define the era. We saw games that were surreal, quirky, experimental, political, and subversive. Manic Miner from Matthew Smith was about a bloke trapped in a weirdo world of penguins and man-eating toilets. Deus Ex Machina was a sci-fi adventure that took you from a cell to old age. The games of Jeff Minter were trippy, colourful, and featured an unsettling number of ungulates. And in a world without clear-cut genres, designers were constantly coming up with unique ideas that would ripple out into future games. School Days, which is about sneaking past teachers and pinching your report card from the staff room, is like an early sandbox game. Kevin Tom's Football Manager wildly predates the Football Manager we know today. A young Julian Gollop cut his teeth on tactical games like Time Lords and Rebel Star before he made XCOM. Perhaps the most influential game of the time, though, was Elite. Made by university buddies David Braben and Ian Bell for the BBC Micro, Elite was an open-ended space trading game which had impressive wireframe graphics and used procedural generation to magic up planets and galaxies. It was unlike anything else, with CVG calling it the most complex game released for the Beeb, if not the most complex program of all. And pretty much every space sim released since counts Elite as an influence, including EVE Online, Wing Commander, and No Man's Sky. but it was also a key influence on early versions of Grand Theft Auto, described by its designers as elite in a city, which basically means the entire open-world genre goes back to the BBC Micro, and that makes Elite a confident design icon. While games were now branded by the software house that published them, the original programmers were still given a huge amount of prominence. Magazine ads would feature the names of the game's creator, and the press would report on designers like they were celebs or football players, perhaps reporting on Matthew Smith's transfer from Bug-Byte to Software Projects, or just tagging along on Jeff Minter's holiday. The press and the software houses created stars of these people. They made them rich and famous, which, for one company at least, was the start of their downfall. Imagine Software, in Liverpool, built itself a reputation on hype and grandeur. The founders of the company bought fast cars, rented a flashy office, and took on staff by the dozens. The newspapers reported on the probably made-up salary of its teenage programmer, Eugene Evans. And in 1984, the company started hyping up something big. It took out full-page magazine ads promising a pair of so-called mega games called Cyclaps and Bandersnatch. Each month, there was a new ad to build up the hype, and this was all being captured in a BBC documentary about the race to make the big Christmas smash hit.
And this is it, Bandersnatch, the ultimate adventure game, which, when it's finished, Imagine claim, will take you into a fantasy world.
Which made it even more embarrassing when the company folded midway through filming. The money had run out because of mismanagement and broken promises. The bailiffs had come in, and Imagine's doors were shut. The mythical mega game Bandersnatch was never to be released, outside of the interactive Black Mirror episode on Netflix, which is a reference to the game. But okay, while some software houses fell to the overspending habits of its 20-something rockstar founders, others succumbed to more humdrum illnesses. Software piracy was a big one. There wasn't much stopping you from copying the game from tape to tape and giving it to a friend or selling it on a market stall. The other was the introduction of more powerful and complex machines like the Amiga and Atari ST, which usually required a full team to make games. So the business model of scooping up the rights to games made by bedroom coders was over. Instead, we saw the rise of dedicated developers like Sensible Software, DMA Design, Bullfrog, and Psygnosis. And they needed big money to invest in upcoming games, often from overseas publishers. But most importantly, there was the introduction of the console. Sure, the UK had dabbled in devices like the Atari VCS and the Sega Master System, but we were usually more interested in Dizzy, Monty Mole, and Chucky Egg than Alex Kidd. But in the early 1990s, the Super Nintendo and the Sega Mega Drive completely dominated the games biz.
There are over 100 Mega Drive games. They get faster, they get harder.
What are you going to do to keep up?
Sure, the Amiga had a strong foothold, but Super Frog and Zool had nothing on Super Mario and Sonic the Hedgehog. So the survivors were typically the ones who were able to adapt to this changing landscape. Software houses like Ocean, Codemasters, and US Gold expanded to include console games, while developers Argonaut Games and Ultimate Play the Game, now named Rare, worked with Nintendo to bring 3D graphics to the SNES. Down the line on PlayStation, Psygnosis hit big with Wipeout, Core Design went global with Tomb Raider, and DMA Design changed the industry with Grand Theft Auto. The UK games biz didn't get completely consumed into the world of consoles, of course, and you could argue that its rich history of computer game design gave it the foundation to be a leading player on PC today, like Planet Coaster maker Frontier Developments, which was founded by elite dev David Braben, or Total War Studio Creative Assembly, which started its life in the late 80s, porting games between different computers. So in the space of a single decade, the UK games industry changed from teenagers selling games from their bedroom to a monster industry propped up by American and Japanese powerhouses. But in recent years, there has been an interesting shift. The barriers to make, release, and sell a game have completely shrunk, allowing anyone with a copy of Unity or GameMaker to become part of the games industry. And this has given the UK a batch of awesome indie games made by individuals, small teams, and tiny development studios. So when Mike Bithell made Thomas Was Alone largely by himself, he was echoing Matthew Smith and Jeff Minter. When brothers Tom and Adam Vian made Snipperclips, they harkened back to the Stamper Brothers making Jetpack, or the Oliver Twins making Dizzy. Simply put, after a long, long holiday, the British bedroom coder is back.